Okay, so I am going to, let's all open up Rhino. And for this time, when you open up Rhino, it's going to ask you what size, what template you want to use. For now, let's use small objects inches. Okay, when you open yours up, yours is probably going to have a dark or darker gray background than mine. I just find that this is a little easier to follow some of these things, especially the when we get into this a little bit. So this is just my preference. You can work and you can change that, but I'm not going to show you how to do that right now. All right, so when we look at this, the other thing that you're going to probably see is that this you have this set of navigation up at the top, which kind of a global navigation that will do the basics. So edit, view, curve, surface, solid, all of these things are kind of basic. And then you have a set of menu systems. In between that is the command line. Okay, so with Rhino you can type commands and input them right there. So like if I want to create a line, I can just start typing line and it will bring up a menu item that you can choose between these things. So this is really quite good. It's almost like a little search feature. So you can say, oh, well, I don't know quite what the command is. Like, I know it's curve or something. Okay, all right, curve, curvature analysis. Oh, here we go, curve. Okay, then you can get into it and start to develop it that way. So this is really handy. It also shows you, sometimes you'll you'll ask it to find certain information. So like I have this rectangle and I want to know what the area of that rectangle is. I can type, I think it's area, okay, and I have three different types, area centroid, area. Okay, so I want that, and bam, here it pulls up the area in square inches right here. So this is going to be not only a place that you input commands, but it's also a place that you get feedback on different commands if you're testing for certain information. Okay. The other thing that you'll notice in the command line, if we do, let's say, curve, is that you have these options. So these are modifiers to that line. I don't expect you to understand what these are quite at the moment, but we'll get into that. But basically, if I want to change this, I can click on it, right? And I can say, okay, I want that to be 2 instead. And then that shows that as 2. But you also see underneath there is a little underline underneath the D or underneath the P. If I was to press D and hit enter, that brings me up to the same place. So you can either click it or you can just use your keyboard shortcuts to make those kind of modifiers. So the command line is kind of important to deal with. On the Mac side, I think that is a little bit more hidden and off to the side panel, off to the edge. So in that palette on the right hand side. So it's not as prominent. So that's an important piece. You can also scroll back and forth, so you can go back in your history. So everything that you do in a session is recorded in this command line, so you can go back and look at what you've done and look at information if you've gone through it once or twice. So that's important to kind of think about. No. You can do it by undo, Control Z, or if you go up to edit, undo, and you can do undo multiple. So you can go back and go way back if you want in terms of commands if you want. And then there's also some history pieces that I'll show you later and more advanced when we get into modeling, that will allow more modifications like you're used to in 3D Max, where you can go back and just modify one thing and it changes everything that's attached to it. Okay, so so then what we have is our standard tabs along the top here. So the standard is great because it has the basic kind of everyday items that you might want to use. You got all your file commands here, copy, paste, your basic navigation of moving back and forth, zooming. and hiding things, elements, how to deal with layers, how to object properties, lights, dimensions if we need to. We're not going to get into that. And then over here on this toolbar, on this side, is a series of basic commands. Okay, so these are your basic construction commands. And these menus will change. So if we go to construction planes, this menu will change here. Okay, if I go to curve tools, you'll see both menus change. Okay, so when you get into surface tools, the actual tools that you're going to create geometry with, each of those menus become much more customized. And this is one of the reasons why I really like the Windows interface versus the Mac right now. So just one of those elements. Okay, so once we have that, pretty much there's very few commands that you will not find kind of represented here. And if you do have to, you can either type in the search, or if, let's say, we're in surface tools, we can also go up into the surface at the top, and then you have a whole list of basically every kind of surface editing tool. And where there's arrows, there's flyouts, okay, that give you different options and different kind of subsets of those tools. Likewise, if you look over here, let's go back to our standard. Whenever you see a little icon that has the little arrow in the corner, if you hold down the click, then it will open up a flyout that you can choose a subset of additional commands. So if I'm down here at a rectangle, if I hold that down, I can create different types of rectangles and in different ways of creating a rectangle. And that becomes important in terms of sometimes you have certain information and you want to construct geometry based on that information, and sometimes it's just easier to construct it that way. This particularly happens a lot when you use circles. You know, sometimes you want to just create by diameter, sometimes you want to create by radius and center points, sometimes you want to create being tangent to different curves. So these are all different nice construction tools of ways of constructing the geometry. So if we go over to the other side, to the right-hand side, what we start to see are what called palettes. Okay, and the basic set of palettes are properties, which talks about the property of any sort of selected item. So I'm going to just create a rectangle here real quick. So if I select that rectangle, you'll notice that that palette changed. So it stopped talking about the viewport, and now it's showing me information about this piece of rectangle. And I can name that rectangle. So if I wanted to call this, this would be good for programs. So like maybe I want to call this Plaza. I can name it, and so I can go back and search and understand which elements are there. It tells me the type of element that it is. It's a closed curve versus an open curve, and I'll get into that in a minute. It shows the layer. So what layer is it on? What it's going to be displayed like, what line type it is. So we can change it. We can make it dashed or dotted or whatever. Print color and print layer and print width. So right now we can see all of this stuff is being determined by the layer. So anything on that layer is going to have all of these properties that we would find in the next piece. We can tell it how to create shadows, and then we have subsets in terms of materiality. So we can assign a material. So right now it's just a curve, so it doesn't make much sense to assign a material to it, but if that was a surface, we could say, okay, let's assign a brick material to that, for instance, or it's concrete. Okay, and then we can do some finer things that we'll get into later about texture mapping much later into the semester, where we can actually start to control how that image gets mapped onto that surface, which becomes helpful when we start to render things. So the next palette over is layers, and the layers here are, you kind of set up with a default set of layers, 1, 2, 3. Layers is super important for you to get a handle of, okay? And think about it as files and folders and organization, okay? And you can organize your geometry in a couple of different ways. One of the older methods of AutoCAD, when I started using AutoCAD way back, was that you would organize your layers like an old set. So if you would do it by line weights. So if you had a thick line, all the thick lines would be represented by one color on one layer and in these different line types. So that's one way of organizing it, and that might be a good way to organize it for Illustrator for these diagrams, is to think about how you want to organize the lines that you're going to use as how they're going to look. Because that way when you're in Illustrator, you can use the layer tools because they come over as layers. Those layers come over, and you can select everything on that one layer and apply it the way it looks at one time, rather than having to select each individual piece of geometry. So start to think about that. When you start to get into modeling, you will probably start to think about it more in terms of elements, physical elements, walls, floors, surfaces, perhaps even different topographies. So you might actually start to split out different topographies, trees, vegetation. So think about it maybe organizing it in terms of elements. A couple of things that you can do is by double clicking, you can rename. You can turn on and off the visibility. You can click on this and it will lock the, so you can't select it. So as you get stuff that you get completed, oftentimes what I'll do is lock it so that I can't accidentally select it and move it and mess with it. So that becomes helpful. As they become much more complicated in your modeling, turning off things is going to be important so that you can't see it. And then you can choose how it's displayed. So one thing that you want to think about is that the way it's displayed on your screen right now, that's controlled by this. But how it's displayed in terms of the print and the print width is all basically here. So you can change the material, the line type. So we can click on this and we can change, different line types. Then we can get into line type scales and stuff later. But also we can change the default width. Right now it's going to default to a hairline, basically. But we could start to add line thicknesses here if you wanted to. But we're not going to mess with that right now, because I think that that's just not what we need. So the next tab, the next palette is the display. And so this is how you can change what's seen and how it's shown in the display. We're not going to get into that right now, but just want to let you know where it's at. And then you have help. So on the help menu, you can do some quick searches, and so you can start to find if you want to know what the curve degree means. So you can look up curve, and then you can go and it'll show you some different explanations. And they also often have little videos that will show you how to use the command properly and what it's doing. So don't be afraid to use that help. In fact, you have to use it a lot. So help and Google search. Okay, those are going to be your two friends. That's how I do it. There's often times where I'm today going, okay, how do I do this? Get on Google, figure it out, put in a couple of keywords, look at some tutorials. Somebody's already figured it out. So don't bash your head going, well, I can't figure it out. Somebody has. Just search. Okay, so that pretty much covers the palettes. Now, to talk about this main screen a little bit is our viewports. So by default, it's broken up into these 4 different viewports. These are orthographic, okay, top, front, right, and then you have a perspective viewport. Okay, so if now Now I might mess this up in the control modifiers because of mine is mapped a little bit differently. But generally to move, you right click. So if you right click in the viewport, like in the perspective, you'll be able to do this kind of global maneuver. If you right click in an orthographic, you'll just pan. Okay. And if you hold the shift down and right click, then you can pan in the perspective. Okay, so those are your kind of main navigation. And then if you use your scroll wheel, you can zoom in and out. And if you're on the trackpad in Mac, two-finger scrolling back and forth also works. Now on the Mac side, you can also get it set up so that you can pan and stuff by just using the two-finger drag around. But, okay, so those are the kind of main keys. Navigation. So when you click on this, the highlight, what viewport you're working in makes a difference. Okay, so the commands, there's certain things. You have to start to think now that we're in three-dimensional space. We have this axis. Right now, it's going to want to put everything on this construction plane. So this little grid tells you where it's going to create geometry. Okay, so right now it's basically at the 0, 0, 0 point. Okay, and so what it's going to want to do is create geometry always in that plane. So if I go over here like I did, I created the geometry, this rectangle in this piece, but what you see is that it's actually being drawn on that plane. So if I draw a curve, all of these things will be drawn on that plane. We can move those planes around. We can create new ones. That's what these construction planes are at. We can lock construction planes and have them oriented to surfaces. So let's say you have an angled roof that you're doing, and it's an angle, a piece of geometry. You can select that surface and say, this is where I want to create the geometry. So if you're going to build, let's say, a chimney on that roof, for instance, coming off of that, you want to have that started as a basis. So you want to create the geometry on as that part, and then build up from that. You can do that. That will get into advanced. Right now, we're just going to look at two-dimensional stuff. So don't freak out. I just want you to understand the concept of it. So some other things you can do here is by clicking on this viewport pull down, or right-clicking, let's say on the Mac side of things, secondary click, right-click, you can change the way these viewports are created. So the way they display. So what I'm going to do is create a box, just so we can see surfaces. So right now, it's in wireframe, but we have other different modes that we can show. So we could show it as shaded. We could show it as rendered. So if we had textures and stuff assigned to that, it would start to show that. We can show it ghosted. And this is the one that I use the most. This is what I feel the most comfortable in, is that you can get an idea of where the surfaces are, but you can see all of the lines and geometry and curves behind there. That's my preferred. There's X-ray, which is very similar. Technical, that shows the dashed lines. That could be interesting. And then there's some other ones that I'm not going to worry about. And then you won't have this one. This is ray traced with neon. And so this one here has actually real-time rendering in that viewport. It's a plugin that's under development that you could download and use, and it's kind of cool, but it's very taxing on the computer. So it's not very fun to use sometimes if I'm on Parallels. Okay, so some other things that we can do, we can use these as print previews. We can also change this view. So let's say I don't want the perspective view. I could go and set it as top or bottom, or I could define another view that I want. I can set the construction plane, because again, like I said, the construction plane and the view is kind of important together. We can also create cameras if we want. This will show you which active viewports, so you can switch by doing that. Most of these things we don't really use too much. So I would say that here in some of these, that's where you're going to mostly be working around. So you can explore the other ones at your leisure, but I'm not going to go over those. A couple of things about the viewport is that you can manipulate the viewport by dragging the margins. So you can make things bigger and set it up however you want. If you click down at the bottom here, you can choose the different sizes or different active viewports, so you can click that there. The other thing I like to do is double click on a viewport, and that'll maximize that viewport. And then these buttons down here allow you to just swap between the different views. And if you want to get back, you just double click to go back. Now if you want to get really into it, you can get into set view and do some different things. There's a bunch of different items that you can get into there. This drop down box here allows you to default to different viewport styles. So split viewport vertically, 3 viewports versus 4. You have all of those capabilities there. So that's the viewport. Okay, and then down at the bottom here, let's say, once we get here, then we have what we're calling, this is the object snapping. Okay, so each of these geometry pieces are made up of lines, and each of those lines have endpoints, and they have points, they have midpoints, they can be intersecting, so back in here they can be intersecting, and we can use these as ways of helping us snap to different geometries. Okay, so to enable that, we have to click over here where it says disabled. We want to make sure that that's enabled, and then those will become editable. Okay, so now if I want to, now that they're turned on and this is selected as endpoint, let's say I want to, yeah, down at the bottom. Okay, let's see here. Let's go down here. Do you have this object snap at the very turned on? Okay. On the Mac, that would be found bottom left corner. Okay. All right, so here is that piece, and then what we can do is, so let's say we want to create a line. Now we can snap to this geometry. So now it's telling us we're at an intersection between lines, and it's also the endpoint of the line. If I come over here, it's snapping to the midpoint of the line. Okay, so those are all wonderful things. So let's say that I want to be, I don't want to necessarily be on that midpoint, but I want to be somewhere on that line, but I want to be able to choose that with more flexibility, is that it will snap to near a line. So if I create a line now you'll see that I can drag along it, and whenever that little tag says near, that means that I'm on a line. Okay, so that means I'll have an intersection. That becomes important later for creating closed geometry, which is important for rendering and things like that, being able to make sure everything is tight and aligned. So there are some other things. You can align tangents. So let's say you have one line, or you're creating a curve. You can have it create such that it will start to hit at its tangent, which is good. Knots get into curves. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Now, remember how I talked about the construction plane? What it's going to do, sometimes when you start geometry in one plane, let's say the 3D, like I start um, here. I have a box. Let's go back. So in the box, when I'm looking at it in the top view, it just looks like a rectangle, okay? And so what might happen is if I'm trying to uh, grab an endpoint, see, it's snapping at the top. It's snapping at the first geometry, not at where on the construction plane where I might want it to be. So what you can do is have it ignore that and go to the construction plane. So now it snaps down to the bottom so that it's on your construction plane. So that can be helpful, making sure things are kind of all on one plane, so you don't have any kind of wonky stuff. This gets more important when you get into surface generation. The construction plane is just this grid. You should see this kind of grid on your screen. Mm-hmm. That's the construction plane. Yeah, well, it's also in all of these views. So here's the construction plane. The construction plane is just going to be this grid work with these axes that show you the X, Y, and Z, so you can orient yourself in space. We can move those later, but we're not going to get into that right now. And you should already have, everything will have a construction plane. You have to have at least one, and there's one by default. And so projecting, all of that does is it just makes sure that wherever you're at, even in the three-dimensional, that it's going to snap to that construction plane. So you make sure that you're always on it. Okay? You can take that off, but oftentimes turning that on is going to be on a case-by-case basis. You just have to be thinking about what you're doing, what you're trying to do. Okay, and then you can turn it all off, because sometimes you get a lot of geometry and you just need to create something and you don't want it to be snapping all over the place. So just turning that off can be helpful, but most of the time you'll have it turned on. Yeah. Yeah, that's the next piece. So Smart Track works in conjunction with your object snapping. So let's say that I want to create a line, and but I want it to be aligned with that, but I want it to be over here. So what you do is you hold over it, and then you'll just hover over that point for a second, and then it will turn kind of white. You can't see it really well. But then when you drag it away, you can see that it will tell you how far you are from it, and it will be aligned to it. So, and it will basically be orthographic. So, and you can set up those snaps. So if you want to snap at 30 degrees or 60 degrees or whatever, then you can do that. Okay, so that's what the Smart Track is on. That can be really helpful, but also it can be really a pain if you have a lot of geometry and it's snapping to all kinds of different points, and then it gets locked on. We'll go into that later. That's a little out of our purview right at the moment.
Unless it's like if I
Yeah, the other degrees we'll have to set up in the units and stuff, and I don't want to get into that right now. So it's not relevant, but really important for what we're doing right at the moment. So the other way to kind of trick it, a lot of times what I do is use construction geometry. So sometimes I'll just draw a line to where I want it, and then I can just go back and delete it. So that's another way of doing it. Okay. So where were we? Okay, so that's smart tracking. Now, if you look at the bottom down here, we start to see basically call outs of this will show you real time where your cursor is at, so you can tell if you're not on the plane or at 0, you can kind of see where your height are. This tells you your units down below. And if you right-click on the units, you can actually go and change the unit settings. So if you need to change the settings, it's important for me, I think, to not switch between units. Pick a unit and use it. And it depends on what I'm doing. If I'm doing architecture stuff, then I'm in inches. If I'm doing product design stuff, I'm always in millimeters. So I switch back and forth. The other thing is this will show you your layers. So you can go and let's say that I want to put this object here on the thick lines layer. I can just click it and then click there. Now it's on the thick lines layer. So you can move geometry really quickly onto the different layers just right through there. Grid snapping means that it will snap to this grid or whatever grid that you set up. Ortho turns on to make sure that whatever line that you are creating is always going to be orthographic 90-degree angles, okay, and set up to the snaps that you've set up. That becomes really handy. The other way you can do it on the fly is if you're creating geometry, if you're creating a line without the ortho on, you can hold the shift key down and that will start to lock it into place. So it'll lock it on that ortho. Okay? So that becomes helpful. And then the last piece, or not the last piece, but the gumball is when you select it, you'll see that it has this modifier. And I'm going to go to the perspective so you can see this a little bit better. What this allows us to do is actually like click and drag and move this thing around just naturally without having to type in the move command. So, and it holds it on its ortho. So that's when we want to move it orthogonally, we select one of those. If we want to move it kind of freeform on a plane, so I want to move it on this XY plane, I can just grab this little grid, move it there. Yeah. And you'll notice here when I change, you'll see that the grid is red and green here. So that means it's moving on those two axes freely. If I start to pan up, you see that that grid changes to blue and green, so I can move it on those two axes. And then these arcs allow me to rotate these objects based on those axes, and they're color coded. Okay? The other thing you can do is you can type in. So if you double click, you can actually put in and just type in numerically how far you want to go, which is nice. And then you have these doggles here, these boxes, which allow you to scale it. And these are scaling by dimension, okay, by a certain axis. And then this little white allows you to relocate that gumball. So maybe you don't want it right in the center. Maybe you want to move it over to this corner. Yeah, so that's why I recommend that you get that the right software on the right side as quickly as possible. But these will be recorded and they'll be up so you can pause it and go at your own speed. So you can relocate the gumballs and stuff like that, but don't worry about that right now. Just keep it pretty simple. We don't need to do any kind of crazy stuff. You can also start to change some of your aspects with your construction plane there. So that's the basics of the interface. The other piece that we have down here that we're going to get into, I'm just going to show you what that is it's record history. So when we create geometry in Rhino, Rhino is based on NURBS curves. but they're not connected necessarily. They don't really have, by default, they don't have any intelligence about what they're doing, okay? So I've created this, sorry, my zooming is crazy. So it doesn't really have any intelligence of what's going on. And I don't expect you to follow this. I'm just doing something here to show you one feature. So what I've done is I've taken a curve and two curves that were done on one construction plane and started to change them, modify them in a z direction. My computer's a little slow because it's recording video at the same time. Okay. Okay, so I just created this surface. Okay, now if I go back and I select this curve and I modify that point, see, it's detached. It has no relationship to the curve. Okay, so what I want to do is when I want to have a relationship with the curve so that they're intelligent about their relationship, I would go and I would click record history. And so now that with that record history, if I do the same command, okay, now if I do this, select OK. Now it's going to modify that surface with it. It's intelligent. Okay, so that is one way of making, when you know that you're going to need to go back and fine-tune something, or you want to have something that is a little bit more editable, that record history can be helpful. And so that's what that does. Okay, the next piece of this right next to it is the filter key. Now, I have mine be popped up over here. Yours might pop up down below if you click the filter. And what that does is it filters what you can select. So you can say, no, I just want to select points, or I just want to select lines. And so you can turn off all of these different things through this navigation. So if I just want points, I just turn off everything but points. Sometimes I use that, but oftentimes I find it easier just to go to the select piece and then just select the geometry here. So if I want to select just points, I can just select points. And when I do that, then it will select the points. So that gives you kind of a rough overview of the interface. And so let's get into just creating geometry really quick. Okay. So let's go back to our for view. Okay, the most important thing to think about in terms of Rhino is that you have several different ways that you can construct geometry. Okay, and it's based on curves. So unlike AutoCAD, some AutoCADs, and definitely unlike SketchUp, these curves are mathematical notations. Okay, so they're completely resolution independent. Okay, they're not segmented up into lots of little lines or anything like that. They're just curves. So even a line that's straight is a curve. Okay, this is a different way of describing it. A curve, a line is just 2 points. A curve uses very similar notation, but it's going to have multiple points. Okay, so just so you're clear, a curve can be straight. Okay, so it's just a nomenclature piece. Okay, and the way you construct geometry is you have a couple of different ways that you can do it. You can construct it by creating the guidelines like I did with that surface where I created 2 guiding lines and then I created another cross-sectional curve to sweep along those 2 lines. There's a whole bunch of different creations, ways of creating. So I can create curves in lots of different ways. Line segments, I can do a perpendicular, polyline. I can create curves here based on control points, which means points that are that control the curvature. Or I can have it interpolate, which means that I want the points to exactly go through these points. Okay? A control point won't necessarily go through your control knot. That's what the knot is down here at the bottom. The knot is a control point. So here is an interpolation curve. You can see it's going through those points. If we're doing a control point curve, you can see how the knots are separate. And if you ever want to look at those, if you do control points over here, select it and then control points, and then you can see it and you can go and modify it. For an interpolated curve, you go right next to it, edit points. So now you can select these points and move them around and edit the curve. But you can see the difference between those two. Personally, I'm almost always using interpolated curves because I want to control intersections and where exactly that line is hitting. But they're both just as good in developing that. And then, then the next piece is to build surfaces from these curves. You can also, if we go to curve tools, we have lots of modifiers that we can do with these curves. So let's say I want to offset this curve. I can type offset, and you can see that I have now this little piece here. It's going to offset at 0.25 of an inch. I can determine whether I want that corner sharp, and if I want to determine, let's say, snap to something, or I want to I don't know what size exactly I want, but I just don't want to do it visually, I can click through point, and so you can start to see how and where it's going to offset. And you can have a cap. So if we have a cap, we can say, let's say, we'll go and click it as round. You can see it closes that edge. So there's lots of different things that you can do with this, which is nice. And there's other things that we can do too. So let's say we have this curve, but we want to select some individual elements. We can explode the curve. You can explode any geometry into its component parts, whether it's a surface, it's a solid, curves. So if we do that, you can see that it exploded a curve into 4 segments. So now we can go and pick out those individual elements again. Okay? And we can edit those. So if I wanted to delete that, then I can just delete that. Okay? The other thing that we can do, I'm going to undo that. So let's say that I've constructed this curve, maybe not through that graceful offset, but I did this all manually, and I've got these 4 curves. The opposite of explode is join. So you can click join, and then it says 4 curves joined into 1 closed curve. So now we have it closed. Okay? Some other tools that we have are split and trim. Okay? So let's say that I have this, and I'm going to use this as a cutting tool. Okay? So the first thing I'm going to do is trim. So it's going to ask me, what are my cutting objects? So I want to cut it with this piece. Hit enter when you're done. And it tells you what to do right here, right? And then select what you want to trim. I want to trim that. Okay, goes away. But maybe I just want to split it. Maybe I don't want to cut it all the way. I just want to cut it right there. So that's where I would use split. So I can select the objects to split. Oops. Hit enter. Select the cutting objects. It's just a little bit opposite. So now it's split into two segments, but it's not, doesn't delete it. Okay. So those are kind of the basic editing tools in terms of modifying a curve. And you'll notice that you have lots of different options about how you create those curves. So just on your own, go and explore those different pieces. We can get into surfaces, but we're going to save that for a little bit later. But basically, a surface is different than a solid. Okay? And the difference is that a surface is just one plane. Okay? But a solid is an enclosed volume. Okay? And it has to be totally enclosed, like a sphere. Okay? Or this shape. As long as it's, consider it, kind of think about it as being watertight, then that's a closed solid. And you can work on both of those, but you can break up the solid into its individual components and they can become surfaces. Okay? When you join a bunch of surfaces together to create a solid, that could be called a polysurface, multiple surface, polysurface. Okay, so if you see that pop up into your screen, that's what that means. Okay, and a polysurface, if it's closed, is a solid. If it's missing something, missing a cap or a box end, then it's going to be a polysurface because it's not a solid. It doesn't hold water. Okay, does that make sense? And very similarly to surfaces, you can use the same features: explode, join, trim, split. All of those same pieces work. The other thing that's interesting is that those trim commands also work if they're not on the same plane, so they don't have to be touching necessarily. So I could move this surface or this cutting tool above it, so it's actually not touching anymore. But if I go into the top view, I can still trim it. Because it's going to project based on the view. So if I project, it's going to basically look at where the view is and then project where those intersections will be apparent. And then that's what it will trim. So no, it would do it. So let's do that. Let's see, it's a very different, because it's based on its apparent view. So, so that's where viewports become important in terms of alignment and keeping things kind of put together. Okay, so we need to wrap up for this. I will post this video. What I would like you to do is just go through the curve tools and start to explore making circles, trimming, making more complex shapes. So take a circle and a square, put it overlap, trim the edges, and then rejoin to that new shape. Just get used to moving, offsetting, explore the different tools. There's too much for me to cover, so you have to kind of do some exploration for yourself. And then the second piece is start to gather your information and start to research the Snøhetta's reindeer pavilion so that you start to understand the context, start on that diagramming piece. That research will come through, and then on Friday we will go through some more in-depth here on how to get into a little bit more interesting geometry creation. And then we will then, on the next week, get into how do we take this stuff and put it into Illustrator. Okay? All right, thanks.